Another big thing is the Nobel Prize. I want to talk to you about the Nobel Prize. It got a lot
Crumbs.
of attention. It
Yeah.
used to be mainly the Peace Prize that is very controversial. I think this
Well,
year, every category seems to have some problem. So let's start with the physics and chemistry. So Jeffrey Hinton, I think that's his name, is one of the
mm,
physical prize
mm,
winner. So he is a computer scientist. He's not a physicist. He is a very accomplished computer scientist, and he got lots of award, this and that. Even he himself was surprised when he got the phone call. So I guess the committee's reasoning for that is because they have been doing some AI stuff, and then that AI helped to create something. And the same thing with chemistry. Chemistry downright just give two of the winners. They are Google engineers, so they are
mm,
definitively not chemists.
mm,
So again, it's a AI something they did in the AI sphere that created something.
mm.
Now, if you use that, that's where the discussion is. You know, the controversial in the at least among Chinese netizens is that, well, in that case, you can just give all your award to computer scientists, you know, to give to engineers. You don't need to give the physicist and the chemist. And there's even people saying, you know, maybe in the future, it will be AI who get the award. You don't even give it to human. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, actually, this is a longer story, an older story than I think people even in China fully understand because it was already an established pattern during the Cold War. So the Soviet Union made a lot of scientific achievements. You know, it did. I mean, it was at the forefront in laser technologies, in all kinds of fields in mathematics. Indeed, by the way, in early computer science, in nuclear engineering, it started the space program. If you look at the number of Nobel Science Prizes awarded to Soviet scientists, they were tiny, were far fewer than a middle ranking British or American university. The way in which the science prizes were awarded disproportionately, they went to English speaking scientists in principally the United States, but also, by the way, to a great degree in Britain as well. And this pattern is now reproducing itself, but it's becoming more extreme because back in the 50s and 60s, the Soviets were certainly effective and important in science, but you could still genuinely argue that the greater amount of scientific activity and the most important breakthroughs at that time were still happening in the West. Not necessarily because the scientists were better, but because the resources were so much greater that they could take their research further than the Soviet scientists could. That is no longer the case today. China can match any science that is being done anywhere in the West. It has resources that are at least equal to it, to the West in science. So, but I mean, Russia is also starting to come back in the world of science, not to the same degree, but it's there. So, Western scientific dominance, to the extent that it's existed at all in the last 50 years, has reduced. But of course, you can't admit this. So I was reading articles a few weeks ago at the Daily Telegraph and other places still talking about how the West has extraordinary degree of scientific leadership, how China can't compete there. It's always China. I stress again, it is always ultimately China. Now, you can't find a genuine physicist, so you come up with a computer engineer. You can't find a genuine chemist, you say you come up with another computer engineer. You say, well, it's all to do with AI. But then, of course, you could have other prizes for that too. As I said, AI ultimately is part of the world of computing. Of
Yeah.
course, the Chinese are pretty good at AI as well. But you know, all of that. So the point is, it's a little bit like the Olympic Games.
Uh-huh.
America must always win. If it
Yeah.
can't win in the accepted known sports, well, you just go on adding more sports so that they can continue to you can continue to win, and you can use all kinds of other mechanisms to make sure that come out top of the tables as well. It's exactly the same thing. Personally, I don't think the Chinese people should be too bothered about Nobel prizes. I mean, this is old European stuff. It was set up, before the First World War by a Swedish chemist who created explosives and all of that at a time when the Europeans were the center of the world, when China was fighting for its life under the blows of the European colonialists and the Japanese, when, most of the world outside China that wasn't European was under the rule of the colonial empires. That world is gone. And taking seriously a prize awarded by a couple of people in Stockholm is nonsense now. High time that China focused on its own prizes, publicized its own scientists, did its own work, offered its prizes internationally. That would certainly attract attention and change the rules of the game on this too.
Yeah, it's a we always know that the Peace Prize is very political, and then later I think the literature is also become more and more political, and now it seems like a physics, chemistry, it's just all the categories. Seems
absolutely. Like. I mean, it's always been so. I mean, again, going back to the 50s, the Americans got their hands on Boris Pasternak's manuscript of Dr. Zhivago. Without asking, without telling him, they got it translated into English. The CIA did it, and within a month, it had been presented to the Nobel committee, which granted Pasternak the Nobel Literature Prize. I mean, all of this done without his knowledge, without his agreement. The Soviets were absolutely furious. Pasternak himself got into trouble. It was all arranged. And again, what it showed was who really runs the Nobel Prize. And that was in the 50s, mind. I mean, it's the control has, if anything, increased even further since then. And as you say, it's all political. All of it is politics now. Nothing happens without that kind of interference, which is really so sad because, it totally contrary to the intentions of Alfred Nobel, who was the founder.
Yeah, the literature is another controversial one this year.
Absolutely.
This author, Han Kang, I'm sure she's a nice person. But when I look at the books she wrote, the one that most prominent one is called The Human Acts, which is describing the uprising, Gwangju uprising that happened in Korea. And that book was banned in Korea for quite some time.
Yeah.
Now, the book was talking about the survivors of those people of that uprising. She was talking about, like, I saw an interview that she has was like 11% of the people who survived that they committed suicide, which is much higher suicide rate than the general public. She's in the book is talking about the trauma, etc. I'm sure it's a good book, but again, it's also a book that is controversial in South Korea. Okay, so they have to find a book that is political, that is controversial. They cannot find any other thing that can be just purely literature, nice literature. I mean, I can find plenty of Chinese authors that wrote, beautiful books and etc. But they have to find somebody who's controversial. And then The Vegetarian is another book that she wrote. Even more, I find very strange. It's about somebody who had many days of horrible dreams and then decided one day she wanted to be a vegetarian. And then because of that, she got isolated by her surroundings. Everybody thought that she was strange. I'm not even sure it's true. I think vegetarian in China, in the people that I thought, mainland in Taiwan, I know a bunch of vegetarians. Malaysia, Indonesia, of course, a lot of Indians. I don't see anybody get isolated by their family for being vegetarian. So it's simply not true. And yet that book, very weird book, also very controversial by a lot of Koreans for various reasons. So an author like that got the award. Isn't that very strange?
Well, it's very strange. And I mean, the fact that China's not received more Nobel prizes for
Hmm.
literature. Given, I mean, anybody. I mean, I'm not familiar with Chinese literature. My wife is a bit more than me. I mean, modern Chinese literature, but I know that it exists in huge quantities, and a lot of it is absolutely outstanding. I mean, my wife has had contacts in Chinese universities. She's been a guest to one of the big universities in Hangzhou. I mean, she has contacts there. She's been commenting about this for years, by the way. So, I mean, already this is ridiculous. Now, about the book on Korea, I would agree with you. About the book on vegetarianism in China, I have to say it surprises me because I know a little about Chinese culture, as your netizens, your viewers know, and I happen to know that China has a huge history of vegetarianism. I mean, there's one of the very most famous restaurants in Beijing. I don't know if it still exists. Was called the Gundeling, which was entirely vegetarian, and it goes
Yeah,
big. It goes back. I mean, decades, probably before all the way to the 19th century. I mean, I don't know how long, but anyway, vegetarianism is a very well known thing in
yeah,
China. It is very well established for all sorts of cultural and theological reasons connected with Buddhism, Taoism, and all sorts of things of that kind. That somebody would feel isolated by becoming a vegetarian in China really does surprise me, actually.
yeah.
Maybe things have changed, but I mean, I don't understand that at all.
Yeah, that's why I don't. This is in Korea, but I just don't believe that people
Mm.
in Korea who become vegetarian will become some kind of a Mariah, by
Well,
the
exactly. I mean, well,
yeah.
if you've been to Korea or to South Korea, which I have done,
Hmm.
again, a society where Buddhism is very well established, extremely well established, where Chinese influence is very strong.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that vegetarianism and things of that kind are not well known in Korea as well. I mean, I don't know much about that because I'm not as so familiar with Korean culture, but I mean, again, these are Westerners might there might be problems with becoming a vegetarian in the West. There are, by the way. I mean, I know that again from my wife, though less so obviously now. But historically, there used to be Western society was very meat eating oriented. But East Asian society, I just cannot believe that. I mean, they have the familiarity with vegetarianism, which is millennial, to say it
Hmm.
simply, to say it as simple as that.
Yeah, and then so the of course the Chinese netizens the comments about that is the Nobel Committee just like people who are troublemakers. They just want your
Yeah,
book to be controversial. They don't
yeah.
really
I,
care about the literature part of it, right?
I think that's fair enough. I think that's exactly what it is. Probably they're not able to make
Hmm.
objective assessments of literary quality. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, I don't know how long this person has been writing,
Yeah.
but once upon a time, you had to be a writer for decades. You had to produce a huge amount of high quality writing, be hugely well regarded by other people in the literary world before you were considered for a Nobel Literature Prize. That doesn't seem to be true anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. If you like the one Chinese author, Mo Yan, who got the Nobel Prize, he's also very controversial in China because he's
Hmm.
in his book. I didn't read that many. I read a little bit. It just made me very uncomfortable because his book is always about how backwards, how poor, how strange lots of the Chinese, habits
Yeah,
and tradition is. It's kind of like a
yeah,
smear, almost like a smear about China. Why
yeah.
does the only person they could pick is him? They couldn't pick anybody else,
Well,
literature.
exactly. Well, exactly. I mean, I think that's exactly correct. I mean, I think that is true. I think they do like troublemakers,
Yeah,
provided, of course, they're not Western troublemakers.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, yeah. And then the same thing with the peace uh, award. Now, this is a grassroots organization that they are anti nuclear war, which is good. I mean, but it's also a group of people who also create troubles for the Japanese government because they have been asking the Japanese government to give compensations for the survivors of the atomic bombs. Now, I don't think anything wrong with that. I think they should do
No.
that. But if your message based on the Nobel price their own saying, their message is they want people to, of course, to be anti-nuclear war. Now, if you want to do that, there are many other good organizations that they should have given an award. I think the most prominent one is what I can think is that in 1967, South American countries, they had a treaty that basically saying we're not going to develop or deploy or do any of nuclear weapons in our territory. There are 33 countries signed to it. It's a treaty of something. And that treaty not only apply to those countries, they themselves don't develop any nuclear weapons. They also ask the nuclear powers to promise not to attack any of those members within that territory, which I really think it's a remarkable thing that they've done. And so far, nobody has violated that terms. How come something like that, that treaty never get any award, right? Isn't it?
Well, because it's far away from the West and it doesn't concern the West and they're not worried about it. So they're not interested in it. They will support a anti-nuclear movement in Japan, which demands compensation for the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki from the Japanese government. Would they do so if it was demanding compensation for the survivors from the American government, which was, after all, the government that actually dropped the bombs? Just saying. I mean, I don't know. As you rightly say, it's an anti-nuclear movement. Perhaps it's a less bizarre award than some of the others that they made in recent years. So we should be grateful for that. But it seems to me that we are talking again about allowed or permitted opposition, as opposed to real opposition, and agreements that other countries come to with each other to avoid the use of nuclear weapons. They're not so interesting to the West if they are made without the West. If the Americans had been involved and had broken this agreement, then the American official who was responsible for doing it would have been awarded the Nobel Prize.
Yeah. And also in terms of Japan, it's always there are very strong feelings in China. And this group, I think, also controversial in particular in China is because in China, people don't see the atomic bombs under that there are that many innocent people. Actually, that's the view. Now, part of it is because at the time, Japan was crazy. The whole Japan was very much into this militarism. I mean, they were well documented in their own newspaper. If you read at the time, they would report things like, oh, a young couple got married and the man will go to China, certainly to go kill Chinese. And the woman feel like, and then the man said, okay, I'm going to leave now, and then I'll come back for you. And then the woman, in order to support her husband, would commit suicide in order for her to support her husband full-hearted to go to China to kill people. So when you see these kind of stories, I actually think that's probably the view. Now, I know in the West, a lot of people thinking the nuclear bombs killed lots of innocent people. That's not the view in China. I would say most of the Chinese people think that there isn't that many innocent people at the time in Japan. That's the view.
I can understand that. I can completely understand that, given what happened and what many Japanese have told me. And they've talked to me about the atmosphere of psychosis that existed in Japan before and during the Second World War. So, I mean, it doesn't surprise me that they think that way.
Yeah. And then the economy, we probably talked about this in the past too. I think the biggest achievement, by the Chinese government, I really think the Chinese government deserve the Nobel Prize in the economy, right? But they will never receive that. So it's always giving to Westerners, right? Again.
Of course, absolutely. I cannot imagine any Chinese economist, especially if he's an economist who works in one of the central planning agencies, being awarded a Nobel Prize. That's inconceivable. All kinds of theoretical economists who, discuss all sorts of, what the effect on money is of this kind of derivative. Those sort of people get prizes, but real economists who actually make hundreds of millions of people, poor people, into rich people. Obviously, you don't talk about them, especially if they're in China. After all, we all know that the reason China became rich was because it stole everything from the US. That's the narrative that you want to promote at the moment.
And I think, the China within the Chinese government, there are poverty alleviation, agencies. There are agencies. The sole focus is for that. I do think they do great job. It's not just a good economic model that you can learn, but also I think it's good for peace, isn't it? Making people lifting people out of poverty. I think it's good for peace. Don't you agree?
It is the most important and best thing for peace.
Mm.
Mahatma Gandhi once said that the greatest violence is poverty. I
Yeah.
mean, and I think he was absolutely right. A government that prioritizes the ending of poverty is by definition a good government which has secured peace and fought violence. But, that is, as many people in the West would say, an East Asian point of view.